It is 2 in the morning on a pirate ship. Below the deck, in the dark, 150 men hang in hammocks 14 inches apart, in a space too low to stand up in, breathing air you could almost chew. A boy of 10 sleeps beside the guns. The wood around them is already rotting. Below them, in the black water at the bottom of the hull, the pumps never stop. This is the ship the movies refuse to show you, and it is the only one that was ever real. We're going to take one of these ships apart, from the outside in, and walk through the town that actually lived inside it. So start with the thing almost nobody tells you about a wooden warship. It was not really a vehicle. It was a settlement. A single fighting ship in the golden age of piracy carried 150 men, by some accounts closer to 200, in a wooden shell whose deck you could very nearly lay down over a tennis court. The trick was that the town was stacked, deck over deck over deck, like the floors of a building tipped on its side and shoved out into the Atlantic. And where a man slept in that stack told you almost exactly what he was worth. The higher you stood, the more you mattered. Rank aboard a ship like this was something you could measure in feet of depth. We'll climb down through it, from the one man who lived in light at the top to the boys who worked in the filth at the bottom. By the end, you will be able to read one of these hulls the way the people who built them could. One quick thing before we climb down. If you would rather have the ship the records actually describe than the one Hollywood sells you, subscribe. That is the whole job here. And we are not going to guess at any of this, because we do not have to. We can use a real ship. In 1717, a pirate named Samuel Bellamy captured a brand new London slave ship called the Whydah and made her his flagship. 10 weeks later, she went down in a storm off Cape Cod, with almost every soul aboard. In 1984, a diver named Barry Clifford found her on the seabed, and she is the only pirate ship ever recovered and confirmed. More than 100,000 objects lifted out of the sand. So when we describe the world inside one of these hulls, a lot of it is not a legend or a painting. It is the physical record. Now, we start where the shipwright started. On the outside, with the hull. Everything a wooden warship was began with the keel, a single long timber laid down the centerline like a spine. Off that spine, the builders raised the frames, the ribs of the ship, each one a curve of oak. And here is a detail people miss. The best of those curves were not sawn. They were grown. Shipwrights went looking for oaks that had forked and bent in exactly the right shape, because a curve cut across the grain would split the first time the ship worked in a heavy sea, and a curve that followed the grain would hold. Over those ribs went the planking, laid edge to edge and pinned home not with nails but with tree nails, long wooden pegs driven through wood into wood, that swelled when they got wet and locked the whole thing tight. Iron bolts held the heaviest joints. The woods were chosen part by part for what each did best. Oak for the frames, and much of the hull, because it is strong and slow to rot. Elm down in the keel, because elm holds up under permanent soaking better than oak does. Pine and fir went aloft, into the masts and spars, and a good deal of the upper planking, because they are lighter and they spring back instead of snapping. A shipwright who put the wrong wood in the wrong place built a ship that failed early, and everyone knew which yards did it right. At the Waterline, where a ship most needed to survive a fight, the builders doubled the planking inward and out until it was thick enough that a cannonball fired from a distance would bury itself in the oak instead of coming through. Up close, nothing stopped a heavy shot. But most of a sea fight happened at ranges where that wall of timber was, in effect, armor. Then the seams between the planks were caulked. Men drove oakum, tarred fibers picked out of old rope, down into every gap with a mallet and an iron, and sealed it over with hot pitch. That is what stood between the crew and the ocean. Fiber and tar, hammered into the cracks by hand. And this shell had to do something almost absurd. It had to carry close to 40 tons of iron guns bolted along its sides, take a pounding from those same guns firing and from the sea itself, and keep a settlement of 200 people alive in the middle of the ocean. It did all of that, but here is the part the paintings leave out. From the day it slid into the water, it was dying. A wooden ship is never a finished, solid object. It is a structure that flexes. The seams work and open a little with every wave, so a little water is always coming in, which is why the pumps you heard at the start of this never really stop. That is the ordinary leaking, and it never gets better. A well-kept wooden warship lasted only about 15 years before it had to be torn down and rebuilt. The real enemy was smaller and worse than leaking, though. In warm water, and the Caribbean is the warmest of hunting grounds, a creature called the shipworm went to work on the hull. It is not really a worm. It is a long, soft clam that bores into submerged oak and eats it from the inside. turning solid planking into a honeycomb you could push a finger through. A badly wormed hull was a floating coffin, leaking everywhere, ready to come apart at the first hard strain. The Navy would eventually beat the worm by nailing copper over the whole bottom of the ship. But that fix came decades after the great pirates were dead. In the Golden Age, there was no copper. There was only tar, tallow, and constant back-breaking maintenance, which is why pirates careened. Every 6 weeks to 3 months, a crew would run their ship into a hidden cove, unload her, haul her over on her side at low tide, scrape the weed and the worm off the exposed hull, and coat the bottom with a mix of sulfur, tar, and tallow before it slowed them enough to get them hanged. A hull thick with weed and worm could cost a ship 2 or 3 knots, and for men who lived by outrunning the Navy, that was speed they could not spare. Captain Charles Johnson, whose 1,724 account is where much of what we think we know about these men comes from, describes the pirates stopping again and again to clean. It was the most dangerous thing they ever did on purpose. A careened ship is a helpless ship, tipped over on a beach, guns useless, the whole crew ashore and exposed. On at least one occasion, Bellamy, the man whose ship we are walking through, simply captured a passing merchant crew and made them do the scraping for him. The work itself was filthy and backbreaking. Everything came out of the ship first: guns, stores, water, plunder, ferried ashore in the boats load by load until she was light enough to heave over. Then they hauled her down on her side with tackles rigged to the masts, exposed the green and dripping hull, and went at it with scrapers and fire, burning the weed off, digging the worm out of the planking, driving fresh oakum into any seam that had opened. It could take the better part of a week, and for that whole week the ship was on her side on a beach, useless, the crew scattered and unarmed, which is exactly when a naval patrol or a rival crew would have loved to find them. They did it anyway, again and again, because the alternative was a hull too slow and too rotten to do the one thing a pirate ship had to do. So hold that in your head as we step inside. This is not a solid oak fortress. It is a leaking, rotting, worm-eaten thing that a whole crew is keeping afloat by sheer labor, hour after hour, and it is the safest place any of them have. Keeping it afloat was not a background chore. It was the shape of every day at sea. Someone was always caulking a seam that had opened, splicing a rope that had chafed through, pumping the bilge, patching canvas, tarring the rigging, scraping and greasing and mending. A wooden ship was a machine that tried to come apart a little every day, and the only thing holding it together was the endless, unglamorous work of the men living inside it. Stop that work for even a week, and the sea and the rot started to get ahead of the crew. Now we go through the side, into the town, and we start at the top of the social order and work down. At the very stern of the ship, up on the highest deck, is the one door on the whole vessel that closes. Behind it is the great cabin. It is the biggest room aboard, and by the standards of everything else we are about to see, it is a palace. It runs the full width of the ship. It has actual windows, a row of them across the stern, so it fills with daylight and with air off the water. There is a table with charts spread across it, and furniture that actually stays where you put it. This is where the captain lived, and on a naval ship it was a kingdom. The captain's word was law, his cabin was off limits, and the gulf between the man behind that door and the men below it was total. Even the geography of the ship enforced it. The closer a man berthed to that cabin, the more he counted. The officers slept just forward of it, then the Marines, then the ordinary crew, and then, far below them all, everyone else. Even the plumbing had a rank. Off the back of the great cabin, built into the ornate carved gallery across the stern, the captain had his own private privy, a quiet seat over the ship's wake, with the sea below and no one watching. It was the only private toilet on the entire vessel. Everyone else on board used what was called the head, up at the very front of the ship, out in the open on either side of the bowsprit, crouched over gratings with the spray coming up and the whole deck able to see. It was one more line of the ship's pecking order, written this time in where a man was allowed to sit. Above the great cabin, out in the open air, was the quarterdeck, the raised platform at the stern from which the ship was actually commanded. That was officer country too. An ordinary sailor did not set foot on the quarterdeck without a reason and an order. So the whole after end of the ship, the stern, top and bottom, cabin and deck above it, was a compound for the few, walled off by custom as much as by timber. Now look at that room again, because you have seen it 1,000 times. The long stern windows, the light pouring in, the captain at his table with his maps. That is the pirate ship of the movies. That is the whole romantic image, the handsome captain in his airy quarters. And that room was real. It existed exactly like that. The trouble is what the movies did with it. They took the one good room on the ship and let it stand in for the entire vessel, as if a pirate ship were a floating drawing room. It was not. That room was a single space at the very back, for one man out of 150. Everyone else lived in the dark. And aboard a pirate ship, there is a twist that makes the great cabin stranger still. In the Navy, the captain owned that space by the authority of the crown. On a pirate vessel, the captain had been elected by the men and could be voted out by the men the moment they lost faith in him. The historian Marcus Rediker, who has done more than anyone to reconstruct how these crews actually governed themselves, describes a world where the captain got the big cabin and the larger share of plunder, but any ordinary hand could push through that door, help himself to the captain's food, and speak his mind to his face. So the grandest room on the ship still belonged to the man in charge. It was just that the men had decided who that man was, and they could change their minds. Step down one deck, and the palace is gone. This is the gun deck, and it is the heart of the ship and the heart of the story. It runs almost the whole length of the hull, and it is crowded, on both sides, with cannon, dozens of guns, each one heavier than a horse, lashed to the ship's side with heavy rope, so the recoil could not tear them loose when they fired. And in the space between those guns, sharing it with them, is where the crew lived. This is the thing the movies cannot bring themselves to show. The men did not have quarters. They had the gun deck. They ate here, in small groups called messes, a handful of men to a wooden tub, at tables slung on ropes from the beams overhead that could be hauled up out of the way in seconds. They slept here, in hammocks hung from those same beams, in the gaps between the cannon. The guns were their weapon, their furniture, and their roommate all at once. And when a fight came, this same crowded room changed in minutes. The tables and hammocks were struck down and stowed, the thin partitions pulled away, and the whole long deck became one open line of cannon, cleared for battle. The crew ate, slept, and fought in the same few feet of timber. Fighting one of those guns took a gang of men, and a kind of controlled violence. 6, 8, a dozen hands to a single cannon, depending on its size. They swabbed the barrel out with a wet sponge to kill any ember from the last shot, rammed home the powder and the ball, then heaved the whole 2-ton weight forward on tackles until the muzzle ran out through the port. When it fired, the recoil threw it back across the deck, and only a thick rope called the breeching, made fast to the ship's frame, stopped it from crushing whatever stood behind it. A gun that broke loose in a heavy sea was one of the most feared things aboard, a ton of iron sliding and smashing across a crowded deck. That was the thing these men ate their dinner beside and slept a few inches above. And when they all fired at once, the effect on the men in that low wooden box is hard to imagine now. The concussion of a full broadside, dozens of guns going off in a space you could not stand up in, was enough to deafen men for hours, sometimes for life. The smoke filled the deck until you could not see the gun beside you. Splinters of oak, torn loose by incoming shot, killed and maimed more men in a sea fight than the cannonballs themselves. And this was where the men lived, every hour of every day, among the very guns that would maim them when the fighting came. The deck was so low overhead that a grown man stooped everywhere he went. It was dark, because open flame near this much tar and powder was a death sentence, so the light came from a few guttering lanterns. It was loud. It was crawling with damp, the wood always sweating, the bedding never fully dry. And in bad weather, when the galley fire had to be put out, the food came up cold or did not come up at all, and it was packed. That 14 inches a man got for his hammock is not a figure I am guessing at. The naval historian Brian Lavery records that the Royal Navy's own written allowance was 14 inches of width per sailor. A petty officer, one small step up the ladder, got 28, exactly double, and you could see a man's rank in the inches he was given to sleep in. Now, in fairness, the ship ran in watches, half the crew on deck, while the other half slept, so a sleeping man often had his absent neighbors 14 inches too, and could stretch to something closer to human. But that math only works if the ship is not overloaded with people, and pirates overloaded their ships with people on purpose. Here is the difference that makes the whole thing real. A merchant captain sailed a hull this size with maybe 20 hands. A pirate crammed in 150. They did it deliberately, because their entire tactic was to swarm a prize with overwhelming numbers so it surrendered without a fight, and because every ship they captured needed men to sail it away. So the pirate gun deck was crowded by a standard most people cannot picture. Take a navy that already treated 14 inches a man as normal, then pour 2 or 3 times as many bodies into the same wooden box. The food ran short fast for the same reason. You could not store provisions for 200 men for long, which is one more thing that kept pirates raiding and cleaning and always moving on. Keep going down, below the waterline now, and the daylight disappears completely. This is the hold, the deep belly of the ship, and it is the storeroom that made the voyage possible. Down here are the water casks, and on a wooden ship water is not a convenience. It is the countdown clock on everyone's life. It went slimy and foul in the barrel within weeks, which is a large part of why these men drank so much beer and rum. Down here is the food, salt beef, and salt pork going gray in the brine, and the hard biscuit that famously came with its own weevils baked in. The diet barely changed from one week to the next, and on a long enough voyage that monotony turned dangerous, rotting men's gums and killing them with scurvy long before any enemy did. Down here is the spare cordage, the tar, the tools, everything needed to keep the dying hull alive. Down here, in the stone and gravel ballast at the very bottom, live the rats, in numbers no one could ever cull. And down here, on a good day, is the plunder, the pantry, the fuel tank, and the treasury of the town, all of it in the dark. Feeding and watering a floating town this size was its own grim science. Both the water and the drink that made it bearable were rationed. Small beer, while it lasted, and then rum, cut with water into grog. Every man's daily allowance was measured out by the purser, one of the most quietly resented men on any ship, because a short measure and a full one both came out of his hand, and the heat and the damp worked on everything stored down here. Meat went off, biscuit crawled, the drinking water grew a skin. On a long cruise, the hold fed the crew and slowly sickened them at the same time, and the smell of all of it rose up through the whole ship. There was more crammed into the belly of the ship than food and water. Cordage and spare canvas and tar for the endless repairs. Firewood for the galley stove, the one open fire allowed on board, boxed in brick and iron and watched like a prisoner. Sometimes a few live animals, chickens or a goat or a pig, kept aft for the captain's table, and no one else's. And threaded through all of it, the ballast, stone, and gravel and pig iron packed into the very bottom. Dead weight, whose only job was to sit low and keep the tall, top-heavy ship from rolling straight over in a blow. And somewhere down here, deep and forward and below the water, is the one room every man on board tried very hard not to think about. The powder magazine. Everything that made this ship a warship depended on gunpowder. And gunpowder is the most dangerous cargo imaginable, on a wooden vessel where every other thing is soaked in tar. So the magazine was built like nothing else aboard. It was buried low, below the waterline, lined and sealed, kept as dry and as far from any spark as the builders could manage. And the rules inside it were absolute, no iron. Men working the powder took off anything metal that might strike a spark and put on felt slippers instead of shoes. The powder itself sat in barrels bound with copper or wooden hoops, never iron. And here is the detail that tells you exactly how frightened these people were. No open flame ever entered the magazine at all. Instead, right next to it, they built a separate sealed room called the light room, and they put the lanterns in there, behind thick glass, so the light shone through into the magazine without a single naked flame ever touching the powder. Beside that was the filling room, where loose powder was measured out into cartridges ready for the guns. The French and Spanish called this whole part of the ship the Saint Barbe, after the patron saint of anyone who works with gunpowder and lightning. Even the name was a small prayer. And who carried those cartridges, up through the dark, past the surgeon, and onto the gun deck, while the ship was being torn apart in battle? Boys. Boys of 10 to 14, chosen because they were small and quick, and could move through the low crowded spaces the men could not, and because their small size kept them below the rail, out of the reach of enemy marksmen. They ran powder from the magazine to the guns, over and over, through the noise and the smoke. When the fighting started, wet woolen screens were hung across the passages to the magazine to smother any spark or flash that came near it, and the boys ducked through those screens on every trip, carrying single charges up in wooden cases, so that no more than one cartridge was ever exposed at a time. Down and up, through the smoke and the dark and the recoiling guns, while the men worked the cannon they fed. They were called powder monkeys, and they held no rank at all. Most of them came off the poorest streets in the world. Remember the Ouida, the real ship on the seabed. Among the objects Clifford's team brought up from that wreck were a small leather shoe, a silk stocking, and a human leg bone. They belonged to a child, somewhere between 8 and 11 years old, who went down with the ship in that storm off Cape Cod, a powder monkey. That is not a painting or a legend. That is a boy, in the archaeological record, at the bottom of the sea, and it is worth sitting with what it means. The youngest and least important person on the entire ship worked in the room built around the one thing most likely to kill everyone. Because if a single spark ever reached that magazine, the whole ship was gone in a heartbeat, blown to splinters, bodies thrown for hundreds of yards, the blast heard for miles. Every man on board knew it, and they sent the children down to tend it. There is one more space this deep, and it is the grimmest of all. On the orlop, the lowest deck, just above the hold, with no windows and no gun ports and nothing but lantern light, the ship's surgeon set up shop when the fighting started. The reason he worked down here was cold and practical. It was below the line of fire. Cannonballs came in along the gun decks above, but this deep, protected by the water outside and the thickest part of the hull, a man was as safe as he could be made. So, this was where they carried the wounded. What happened down here was butchery, and the people who lived it said so. Accounts describe the surgeon and his mate covered in blood from head to foot, looking more like men in a slaughterhouse than doctors, working by swinging lantern light on a floor gone slick, while a boy poured sand across the boards so nobody went down. They called that boy the loblolly boy, and his jobs were to carry off the amputated limbs, sand the blood, and keep the tar hot for sealing wounds. In the Caribbean, the heat down there, with no air and a gun deck roaring overhead, was its own kind of torture, and after a hard action, 90 wounded men might be waiting in that cramped dark at once. And here the record actually takes the crew's side against the movies. The films have the sea surgeon reaching for the saw the instant a man goes down. A good surgeon put that moment off as long as he possibly could, because he knew how many men died afterward of the shock and the rot, and he kept amputation for the cases that gave him no other choice. There was nothing to dull the pain. A wounded man got a leather strap or a musket ball to bite on, a swallow of rum if there was any to spare, and strong hands to hold him down. Speed was the only mercy the surgeon could offer, and a good one could take a leg off at the thigh in a couple of minutes, tie off the vessels, and move to the next man while the last one was carried away. Around them, coiled in the same dark, lay the great anchor cables, wet and stinking and full of rats, because the orlop was also where those were stowed. This was the floor a man came to when the ship above him was being torn apart, and everyone knew the arithmetic of the place. Two of the men who wrote this world down were naval surgeons, John Moyle and John Atkins. And Atkins sailed on the very ship that finally ran down the pirate Bartholomew Roberts. Their books are a large part of the reason we can describe this deck at all. Every man carried down those ladders knew his odds, and they were not good. And then there is the bottom. Below the orlop, below the hold, right down inside the curve of the keel, is the bilge. And the bilge is where everything ends up. All the water that seeps in through those working seams runs down and collects here, and it does not run back out. It sits. It mixes with the ballast, with the rot, with everything that has ever spilled or drained down through the ship, and it turns into a black, stinking soup that was, by every account, the single worst thing about being on a wooden ship. Sailors said you could smell a ship's bilge on the wind before you could see the ship on the horizon, and it had to be pumped, constantly, by hand, or the water rose and the town sank. The pump itself was a brute of a machine, a chain of leather discs hauled up through a wooden tube by men turning cranks or heaving on brakes, lifting the bilge water up and out over the side. It was the most hated work on the ship, and it never truly ended, because the sea never stopped finding its way in. On a leaky hull in bad weather, men pumped in shifts around the clock just to stay level, and if the pumps ever fell behind the leak for good, the ship went down under them. That black water was also where much of the sickness on board began, breeding in the dark under everyone's feet while they slept. That job, standing in the dark over the foulest air on the vessel, working a pump that never finished, fell to the ship's boys and the lowest hands aboard. So look at what we have just climbed down through. It starts at the stern with one man in a bright cabin behind the only door on the ship that locks. It ends, decks lower, in the black water, with the youngest and poorest boys on board working a pump they can never finish, breathing the worst air on the vessel, doing the one job that keeps every other person alive. Nobody wrote that order down in so many words. It was built into the timber. You could work out a man standing just by how far down into the ship you had to climb to find his berth, and how little daylight reached him when you got there. And every one of those men had chosen it, or been driven to it. On a pirate ship, most of them had signed the articles and voted for the captain over their heads, and still ended up crammed into 14 inches of a rotting hull, eating spoiled food, breathing poisoned air, a few feet from a room that could vaporize them all. They did it for a shot at plunder and freedom of a kind. And because the ships they had come from, the Navy and the merchantmen, often treated them worse. That is the town we have just walked through, top to bottom. Now let us put its most famous version on trial. Which brings us back to where we started, and to the one claim worth putting on trial. The pirate ship of the movies is a beautiful, spacious, sunlit thing. All open decks and grand cabins and room to swing a sword. Now put the record next to it. It is dark, wet, and overcrowded. A slowly rotting box with 200 people stacked inside it 14 inches at a time, and the pumps running day and night. Set those two ships side by side and it looks, at first, like the movies simply lied. But that is not quite the verdict, and the honest answer is more interesting than the easy one. The movies did not invent their ship out of nothing. Every detail of that gorgeous cabin, the stern windows, the light, the charts, the open space, was real. It just was never the whole ship. It was one room, at the very back, for one man. Hollywood found the single most comfortable corner of a floating slum and quietly expanded it until it swallowed the entire vessel. So the myth is not really a lie. It is a matter of scale. The romantic galleon was real. It was about the size of a modern living room, and everyone who was not the captain lived below it in the dark. Now that you can read one of these ships, you can walk onto any of them and see what its wreck is really telling you. And there is one wreck that matters more than all the rest. Off the coast of North Carolina lies what another captured slave ship became, the flagship of the most famous pirate who ever lived, a man named Edward Teach, better known to the world as Blackbeard. In the next video, we'll take his Queen Anne's Revenge apart the same way, plank by plank, and separate what the seabed can prove from what the legend added on top. Before you go, one question, and I do read these. You have just signed the articles, and you get to pick your station. Do you want a place on the gun deck, in the noise and the smoke, sleeping between the cannon, or a place below in the quiet of the bilge, where no enemy shot can reach you but the air itself is poison? Tell me which one you would take, and tell me why.